Well, Russia's economy crept out of recession at the end of last year. So for more on how Russia's economy is doing and what it's doing diplomatically to build economic ties with other countries, let's bring in Charles Ortel. He's the founder of 5 Ventures. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me back on, Rachelle.
Now, Charles, we know that Russia vetoed this UN draft resolution surrounding a probe into the recent chemical attack in Syria. Also, talk of more sanctions, especially voiced by Britain's Boris Johnson, but no action, though, from G7 leaders. But how would sanctions potentially impact Russia's economic outlook?
Well, my sources tell me that in some quarters in Russia, they're actually happy to go through the experience of sanctions to try to wean themselves off dependence on the West and build relations with allies like China and others around the world that have great long-term potential. One thing to remember about Russia that most people like to forget is that Russia doesn't really have a lot of external foreign debt the way we do in this country in the U.S. and many other Western countries do. So sanctions hurt, of course, they make life more difficult, but they're not really, they're a blunt tool as opposed to a sharp weapon.
So as you mentioned then, this potential pivot to looking at other economic allies, especially if Europe and the US are kind of pivoting away from Russia. So who would Russia be looking to?
Well, very clearly, I believe that Russia and China signed massive agreements last year that were quite significant and hold great potential for both countries. The world is a big place. There are lots of export markets. Russia, after all, was sort of outside of the mainstream global system for decades. It takes a while to catch back up, build your infrastructure. Most people, we look at these flat maps that don't really show how big a country truly is relative to other countries. And Russia, though it has less than half of the United States population, is 1.8 times the size of our country. So it's got a lot of infrastructure to build out, a lot of potential, a lot of untapped potential. And I think it's a shame, frankly, that we haven't been able to listen to one another, particularly over the last 8 years under Obama, but even going further back, and now under Donald Trump, and understand, what each country wants to get out of a relationship, what each country fears, and what we can do together to make our two countries and the world a safer place.
Definitely seems to be a low point at the moment between US and Russia relations. Now, despite all this, though, we saw that Russia's economy just saw its first growth in 2 years. What additional pressure do you think these new developments could have on that progress?
Well, I think the biggest pressure on Russia's economy and the biggest driver of growth is energy prices. And when energy prices are sinking, Russia's and all energy producers suffer. Russia is still pretty concentrated in energy and energy exporting. So some firmness in the energy markets helps them, and the opposite is also the case.
So certainly a double-edged sword there. So what about what's helping fuel Russia's growth, even as oil prices continue to be low and a lot of the organizations, including OPEC and IEA, are predicting lower demand on top of that?
Right. Well, I think in the case, as I say, of Russia, they have their new agreements with you, with China and other countries. It is not simply an energy-based economy. They have gotten into the high-tech sphere. They have that complex, I guess, I forget exactly where it is, but I believe it's pronounced Skolkovo. They're trying to harness advancing technologies. There are plenty of very super smart people in Russia with PhDs, et cetera, who can build out high-tech companies. So, they're beginning to see some signs of growth here, and they're doing it, as you say, in a period where oil prices have been suppressed and when they're also under sanction. Imagine how they'd do if they weren't under sanction.
So give us a look at the big picture. Just how important is Russia's economic relationship when it comes to China and other BRICS countries?
I think it's extremely important, particularly with China, in that, Russia has such vast untapped stores, not only of oil and gas, but of other minerals, timber, et cetera. It's relatively underpopulated. And in contrast, China, it does not produce quite as much energy. So there's some very obvious areas of potential cooperation there. When you look at income levels in Russia versus income levels in the developed parts of China, there's a vast disparity. There are lots of construction projects that need to get going, lots of transportation projects. So, it's a natural thing for those two countries to do a lot more together over time.
And for everyday Russians, what sort of confidence do they have in Russia's economy and its ability to really stimulate more growth?
Well, I'm not an expert on the long span of Russian history, but I'm familiar with it. And, Russia has long, looked inwards and long been accustomed to being under foreign threat. And I would note that Vladimir Putin, is still very, very popular inside Russia. So, I think he's popular. I think the average Russian, is probably not particularly distressed at the present state of relations with the West, and hopeful for the future.
Now, we did touch on oil as being something that could be a positive or a negative for the Russian economy. Any other potential headwinds you see outside of that sector?
Well, I think the biggest potential headwind for Russia, when you really look at the hard numbers, is that, like it or not, the United States and its Western allies do spend a tremendous amount on military and defense expenditures around the world. And it's one thing to just talk, and it's another thing to think that you might get involved in some kind of military conflict, Russia versus the U.S. That would be very, very dangerous for the U.S., but extremely dangerous for Russia. So I don't think either country wants to go into that place, though sabers might rattle. And I'm hopeful, finally, that now that Lavrov and Tillerson have met in person, and now that perhaps Trump and Putin may meet in person, that we can think creatively and out of the box how to get out of this mess, how to fight common enemies, and how to work productively for the world's benefit.
We'll certainly have to see how those geopolitical tensions pan out. Thank you so much, Charles Ortel, founder of 5 Ventures.